Welcome to the Law, Your Money, and You. I'm Roberta Saphire, an attorney in Sharon.
And I'm Camille Barron, financial coach, also here in Sharon. Roberta, if you remember a few months ago, we had Emily Smith-Lee here, local attorney, talking about foreclosures and what are some of the rights of people, particularly those who are being threatened with foreclosure. Well, you know that we got so many emails about this because it's such an important topic today. So we do have Emily as our guest again.
Right, and I thank you, Emily, for coming. A little way in introduction, Emily is also on the school committee in Sharon, and she hosted a young man from Chile at the local Rotary event, and that must have been very heartwarming, but which has nothing to do with foreclosures. But it's interesting that people do other things. But okay, let's pick up where we left off, and thank you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So, Emily, the last time you were on, we talked more in general terms about foreclosures, and you explained to the viewers what some of their options are if they get into a situation where they might have to go through foreclosure. You gave them lots of alternatives, and you gave them a good synopsis of what their rights are. I think since then you've had some cases that you've dealt with, and probably a little more, adding some more insights for people, and that's why we asked you to come back today.
Sure.
So can you tell us what's going on today in terms of foreclosures? Are there more of them? Are there less of them? Are we seeing any improvement in the situation, or is it getting worse?
The folks I tend to be people who have gotten into trouble with their mortgages already and are in the middle of trying to navigate the waters of the loan modification programs that we talked about last time. And one thing that I would say to people watching is, if you're in that process and if you're getting communications from the bank and if you're terribly, terribly confused, you're not alone. It has taken us 5
I thought you were going to say, this is what to do. No, you're not alone. That's funny. Yeah,
but it is important, because I think it's taken us another half a dozen clients to really feel like we're starting to totally understand the dynamics of this HAMP program and why some people really get through it and why some people really don't get any relief. But it's not apparent from the form letters that the bank will send you as soon as you get behind on your mortgage. It's not apparent from what their call center people will say to you on the phone. It's a jungle. So over the last few months, we've had a chance to work with people with sort of different aspects of the problems. And one thing I think that's important for people to understand about the loan modification program, which has also been called the Obama modification program, which is also known by some as the HAMP program.
And what does HAMP stand for? Do you know?
HAMP stands for Home Affordable Modification Program. And we may have covered this ground before, but just quickly by way of backdrop, as part of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, otherwise known as the bailout, a large chunk of money went to this program in order to give banks incentives to help keep people in their homes by lowering their interest rates, stretching out the years on their mortgage, whatever it is that could be done to make the payment affordable rather than foreclose.
Well, let me stop you there. That was the intent of it. If you had a group of consumers here in this room, would you think they would say that the banks have been trying to help people stay in their homes?
I think depending on what servicer or bank people are dealing with, people may say they've been trying. I don't think you would find a lot of people to say it's been successful.
Yeah, I think the last time you were here, too, in between, that a lot of the banks, especially in Massachusetts, stopped foreclosure because there was a question that they didn't do the paperwork right. To do it.
And that's a separate issue, but it arises out of the same situation, right? The same.
Well, it gives them more time anyway.
Yeah. But without getting too complicated about it, given that one of the things that led to the bank crisis and the foreclosure crisis was the result of a lot of selling of loans, selling of mortgages, selling of notes, it just was a feeding frenzy for a number of years. So when banks actually have to prove their right to foreclose now, they've had to do things in such a hurry because the number of foreclosures have gone up so high that that's when they got into what's been known as robo-signing, you know, having people without authority sign assignments. And what that all really just means in plain English is that if, let's just say Bank X, I won't pick on any particular bank, Bank X wants to foreclose on your house, they are supposed to have documentation that show that they're actually the holder of the note. But Bank X might actually be the 15th holder of the note. Bank X might be an investment fund somewhere that holds a little piece of the note and somebody else holds a piece of the note.
So what you're saying is that it wasn't assigned to them properly?
Or possibly it was, but a lot of them have had difficulty proving that.
Oh.
So that, to your point, Roberta, that issue doesn't necessarily keep people out of foreclosure forever, but it does give you some ability to push back and buy a little bit of time. The other issue that's been evolving, you know, one is the paperwork issue, the other is the HAMP modification issue, and people trying to make sure the banks are following their own rules in administering that. Then the other is the sort of growing body of law around predatory loan practices. So there's certain kinds of mortgages that there's at least an argument that that enforcement of that note shouldn't be allowed because they were unfair to begin with.
Can you give us an example of the type of mortgage that would be?
Sure. The headline example was something that a loan product, Fremont Loan, had. They recently settled with the Attorney General, not so recently anymore. Those are loans with very rapidly escalating interest rates. They're loans that basically you can't continue to afford unless you assume that the market keeps going up and you continue to be able to refinance your property. A more recent example is what some people may have, which is known as an option arm. That's an adjustable rate mortgage where you have a choice every month. You can pay the full mortgage, which pays off principal. You can pay interest only, or you have the option to pay a lower payment that doesn't cover all of your interest. So it sounds great, right? The truth is that very few people can use that to their advantage because every time you pay the minimum payment, your principal balance grows. So you may take out a loan for $300,000. If you keep making that minimum payment, that $300,000 number is just going to keep going up.
And then do they charge you interest on the interest? Because if you didn't...
Yes. And then if you want to refinance out of that loan, your principal balance may have grown beyond what the house is worth, even if you weren't underwater to begin with. And once it gets to a certain point, then they kick you right into a full payment. Excuse me. So a lot of people were qualified for these loans based only on their ability to pay the minimum payment.
But would you call that a good class action suit where they've done so much of it? I mean, because sometimes you see them advertised, have you done this, have you done that, almost everything you're saying there.
It could come to pass. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to class action suits, and you know whether they can be brought in that format. But absolutely, there's an argument that this is a structural problem with the loan, that it applies to a lot of people in a similar way, and you may well see that happening.
The banks would really get banged, but good.
Yeah.
With all the law, well, this loan was no good, this loan's no good, this loan's no good. Or maybe it's the people that they assign it to. You know, like who are these people that they assign it to? Half of them you've probably never heard of.
Right. And that's a complicated question too. Sometimes it's just another bank. Sometimes it's a pool, an investment pool. But yeah, I think it is a legitimate risk for mortgage lenders that some of these structurally unfair loans, and this is what happened in the Attorney General's case. You know, Attorney General Coakley was able to prove that a certain class of loans were structurally unfair. That ended up settling, but part of the settlement is that particular bank has got to come get her okay before foreclosing. For people who hold that kind of loan.
Oh, good for her.
And
good for them.
So whether that's going to happen with the option arms, it's hard telling. But if people have option arms, and sometimes they're called pick a payment, they're called different things. Anybody who's got a loan with the choice of making a payment that doesn't cover the interest should take a good, long, hard look at where they are in that loan. If they're still in the window of time where they can get out of it, that would
Have
be a
you
good
heard
idea.
of banks offering the people money to get out of the house instead of foreclose? You sign it over to us, we'll give you some money. Or we're foreclosing, we'll give you some money to get out instead of staying on.
Yeah, that's known as cash for keys.
Cash for keys.
Cash for keys, yes.
What do you think of that?
And, you know, you can understand it from the bank's perspective, and you can understand it from the homeowner's perspective. If you really have to foreclose on the house, the auction sale isn't the end of the story. Once they sell the house, they've still got to get you out of it, which means they've got to go through what's called summary process. They've got to go to court. You can, you know, think up some grounds to fight that. You can ask for stays. So practically speaking, you know, even once the foreclosure happens, if you haven't been able to avoid it, there's ways to put delay in it that's costly to the bank. So it makes some sense for the bank to pay a little bit of cash. It makes some sense for the homeowner, maybe get their moving expenses paid, or you know, have something to start over with. I have to say it's not automatic. I think it would depend on the situation.
How willing are the banks these days to give out the loan modifications?
I think willing may be the wrong word. Very, very few modifications under the HAMP program have actually happened and turned into permanent modifications. And whether that's because the banks are not willing, or because the system is very complicated, or because, and this is important for people to know, if you're thinking about a HAMP modification, the window of people that can actually serve is much narrower than you would think. So it's important for people to be realistic about that. They can only bring your mortgage payment down to 31% of your gross income. So if your ratio is lower than that, there's nothing they can do to help you, and you're going to get
Is
screened
that
up.
the total gross, husband
Yes.
and wife?
Yes. If you're more than if your mortgage is more than 38% of your gross monthly income, they can modify your loan, but they don't get paid for it. So there's actually a pretty narrow band of people who are eligible for that. The other thing that I think gets people into a lot of trouble is the eligibility criteria looks pretty straightforward, right? You can look at your bank statement, you can look at your pay stubs and say, okay, I'm at 36% of my income, I must be eligible. Great. And then what happens then is sometimes people stop making payments so that they can go into default and be considered for the HAMP program, but they haven't really thought about the other piece of it, which is once you're eligible, the bank still has to determine, they do this hopelessly complicated thing called the net present value test. Basically, they want to figure out, is it a better deal for the bank to foreclose on your house or to do the modification? A lot of people fail the net present value test because they're already in
So
default.
what do? They probably can't afford an attorney because they can't afford their mortgage payment. Is there any agency that helps them?
Yes, people should look, it's called Hope for Homeowners, if you just Google that. There are HUD-authorized, HUD meaning the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD-authorized counselors who provide some counseling for free. They can't promise you that they can get you a modification. They run into the same problems even attorneys and homeowners do, which is you file the application and you go through a very long bureaucratic and not terribly informative process. They have the same problems with that as everybody else, but they're not taking your money. And they're not, there are people out there who are doing this for a fee and who are making unrealistic promises to homeowners about how much they can save and what the upside is to them. So the Hope for Homeowners would be the first stop that I would recommend. And when, I won't say if, I'll say when people run into roadblocks in that process, I think going to talk to an attorney is a good step. I would say go talk to an attorney that you found somewhere other than the internet or the Yellow Pages or the television. Nothing wrong. There's lots of good, honest people practicing law there.
Yes.
But there's lots of people, there's opportunities in every crisis. And this is one of those situations. I think it's really, really important to people to have some trusted, realistic advice.
Yeah, and they should watch out for forms on the internet, because I had a client who brought me some forms. He says, oh, look, I got them right off the internet. It says good for Massachusetts. I says, yeah, but Massachusetts doesn't have a law for that. I says, those are standard forms, don't listen to them, you know? Write them and ask them what law school they went to. You know, it's a favorite expression when somebody starts telling you what the law is. You go, well, what law schools did you go to? Well, I saw it on the internet. So you're right. Don't expect it on the internet.
Yeah. And, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the internet. I'm on the internet. But in a case like this, people should also be aware if there's a lot of sort of online calculators to figure out if you're eligible or not. People ought to be careful to make sure that they're on the HUD website.
Oh, and not a
they do that.
scam one.
Because people
Not a
can-
look-alike one.
Well-
They have the look-alike websites.
And once, if you're entering data into a lookalike website, and it's there for the purpose of mining your information, then you're going to get bombarded with solicitations by people who want to promise you, you know, they can cut your mortgage payment in half, or they can do all these things for you.
Yeah, meanwhile, they're taking, isn't that funny? They got a scam a day. There must be, they keep thinking them up. We had one, the employment one, the identity theft one, all kinds of scams.
Yeah.
When someone is in the situation, one of their options might be to apply for a loan modification if they're eligible. What about looking into refinancing and loan and debt consolidations? Do you recommend that for people too?
Yeah, I don't have a particular expertise in credit counseling, but if you're one of the lucky people who's got equity in your home and you're having trouble with the mortgage you've got, particularly if it's one of these predatory products, absolutely.
I think our last guest, Tony, of Money Watch, he does that with people. He takes
Yes.
what they have
Yes,
and
he
he
does.
figures what you can pay. And it's funny, that's a talent by itself as opposed to mortgages, which is another talent. But what's an interesting issue that you've had up since the last time?
Let's see. Well, we did try a case on one of these option arms.
You did?
We did. We tried 4 days in federal court, ultimately settled. But that was very interesting, and it came very close to home how new a lot of this stuff is in terms of the law.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about it without breaching any?
Sure. This is a couple who had one of these option arms, and they had attempted for over a year to get a loan modification, and they kept getting turned down without an explanation. As it turns out, the reason that they were getting turned down is that when the bank tried to figure out whether they were at 31%, they were using the minimum monthly payment. So in other words, if you took the payment that they would have had to pay to not dig themselves deeper and deeper into the hole, they were completely eligible for HAMP relief.
Yeah.
But the bank choosing to do it that way kept them out of eligibility. In the meantime, the principal on their balance, the balance had grown so much that they owed way too much more money on the house to really be properly refinanced in any reasonable way.
So what type of settlement do you reach under circumstances like that? Because every day they're owing more and more.
Right. Unfortunately for this conversation, we have a
Oh, okay.
confidentiality agreement
All
for the
right.
settlement.
So-
But I will say there's lots of ways to skin the cat once you get to the settlement table, you know.
Now, did the bank do that on everybody, or was this a particular case? Maybe they didn't want it looked into.
I think, to not be too cynical about it, I think everybody does what they can get away with.
Yeah.
And if you've got a good basis to push back, and you find somebody who can stick up for you, you're much more likely to get to the settlement table.
Now, what does that do to the person's credit?
The person's credit, unfortunately, is usually quite problematic by the time it gets to that point. Because typically they've stopped paying their mortgage while they're in the process of trying to get the loan modification. And that's another thing that people should know. The choice of whether to stop paying your mortgage while you're applying for a modification or not is a really, really tough one. On the one hand, you get in a lot of trouble at the end. If you're a year and a half in default by the time the bank makes a decision on your modification, it's much harder for them to justify that because your credit's tanked, your likelihood of default looks higher.
Yeah.
On the other hand, a lot of times I've talked to people with the opposite experience. They're cutting things to the bone to afford their mortgage payment, and then get turned down for a modification because the bank doesn't believe they're in imminent danger of default because they're paying their mortgage.
Oh, yeah.
So
You're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
you are. And that's another stage where I'd say, before you get yourself too deep in a hole, find a trusted advisor, find a lawyer you know, call a head counselor, because in some situations it might be a good decision to stop paying, in some situations it's really not.
Well, just like anything else that has to do with the law, particularly around things like this, it's good to be informed and go to an expert who knows your rights and what will get you into trouble and what won't.
Right.
Now, if somebody does try the loan modification route and they get turned down, is the next step to go through the foreclosure process?
There are a couple of other options that the banks are required under HAMP to offer you. One is called a short sale, which is probably a familiar phrase that's been bandied about a bit. Essentially, that's just the bank says, get an offer on your house, any offer. We'll review it. If we accept it, then we won't consider that you owe us the difference.
Because the houses, if you have a house for $500,000 and now it's only worth $300 and you owe $400, so you get an offer for like $299, the bank accepts it. But who signs the paperwork on that? Does the bank sign something, or does everybody sign?
It's a process that I'm less familiar with, but generally speaking, you'll ask the bank to approve a short sale. They'll say, great, you have our blessing, put it on the market, come back to us with an offer. And they still have the right to turn down the offer. It's not really in their interest because their alternative is to sell it at foreclosure,
Right.
which would probably get them less money anyhow. Short sales are less harmful to your credit than foreclosures. Still not great. But again, that's why I say people need to be realistic. Sometimes that's the right decision.
So that's a
Without-
situation where the house is worth less than what you owe on the mortgage, and in order to do that, that condition has to exist. So if that doesn't exist, then what?
You mean if the house is worth more?
If it isn't eligible for short sale, because it's not in that situation where it's worth less?
Yeah.
Sounds
If
like
your house is not underwater, this is the other thing that people don't fully understand. If your house is not underwater, it's going to be much harder for you to pass the net present value test for the modification.
Oh.
Put more simply, you're less likely at the end of the day to get a modification because the bank's not going to lose money by selling your house.
Okay.
So if you have equity in your house, you know, I think the non-legal alternatives are the things really to look at. Can you really afford your house? Can you refinance into a better product?
Yes.
How about the people who, once they see the handwriting on the wall, they leave and they take the refrigerator, the stove, the faucets, the toilets, and they just take off? Imagine having to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think back to your earlier question, I think that's a big reason that they do sometimes do these cash for keys thing. That's a huge expensive headache for the banks.
Yes, so they don't want to. I got a call. Somebody was a tenant in I think it's a 6-family out on the other side of the state, and they go, I got a letter from the bank saying that if I move, they'll give me $2,000. Well, take it. You're not paying the rent anyway. You know,
Right.
Take it.
Right.
Emily, are they usually,
Take it, and you have to get out, though.
let's say someone has to go through the foreclosure process. What happens when they're done with that? Well, suppose they can't afford to live, they can't afford to rent a place.
Yeah.
What happens?
They
Great
move.
question. You hope they're lucky enough to have a support system. You hope they're lucky enough to
Yeah, they
You know,
move
to find
into
a-
relatives, or they combine households.
Yeah.
You're hearing about that more and more, where people are combining households, or where the children say to the parent, build an addition for me you can live on, or the parent says to the children, you build an addition and you can live there. And they're
Right.
doing more and more. It's interesting.
But no, you're right. I mean, it's a significant problem.
Well, we're about ready to go to You've Got to Be Kidding segment, which you partook of before. But when you were saying about, you know, what do they do? Why don't you? Oh, here, I think it's in You've Got to Be Kidding bag. And
That's new. I don't think there was a bag
That
last
bag
time I
is
was
new.
here.
no, there wasn't a bag. This is our You've Got to Be Kidding bag, and it says right on it, You've Got to Be Kidding. And when our readers, I keep saying our readers, maybe we'll read about us someday. When our viewers send us emails, or sometimes you see people on the street, they go, oh, look at, my cousin was here, he sent that. We throw it in the bag, and then we take it out and we read it. But Camille had a good one on what somebody did when they were going to foreclose at their home.
This fellow, his house was going to be foreclosed, and he was very, very against even cooperating in any way with the bank. He tried everything, and the bank just wasn't going along with it. So he said that he got an offer of $170,000 for someone to pay off the house, but the bank refused, saying they could get more in foreclosure.
Yeah, the same thing.
And he said to the bank, "I'll tear it down before I let you take it."
And
And
they
that's
said,
exactly what he did. He bulldozed the house down.
You've got to be kidding.
No.
I hope he took the appliances out first. Imagine. I mean, I can picture that. But another thing, this has nothing to do with foreclosures, but we can do that in our You've Got to Be Kidding segment. A little 7-year-old boy, he wanted to see his father. He lived with his mother and stepmother, and he took their car and drove to see his father, and he drove more than 20 miles before the police finally stopped him. They said the car was going back and forth. At times he was going 70 miles an hour.
You're going to be kidding.
No, isn't that something? And this one is a real funny one. This is I don't know. You're not going to see the picture, but nobody would want to see the picture. It's an older man who looks like a professor in these underwear and a big midriff and big long stockings coming up there, and they let him on the airplane like that. It says this unnamed scantily dressed passenger was allowed to fly U.S. Airways from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to Phoenix. The photo was captured by a passenger, and less than a week earlier they had this young fellow who was there. You know how they're wearing their pants low, and they wouldn't let him on until he put his pants up, but they let this guy on.
You got to be kidding.
No, not
Well,
kidding.
One last thing is that
You got one
a fellow
last
had, there was a mix-up that he was charged property taxes for a house that was actually a similar address to his. It wasn't his address, but it was worth about twice as much. So he pointed it out, and meanwhile, the bank was after him to he's saying that we're going to foreclose because you haven't paid your taxes. And he said it took about 4 years to get that settled. He said because an attorney didn't want to take the case because they were afraid to go against the financial institutions. So with that, I think we're just about out of time, Emily.
Okay.
It's too bad because I wanted to talk more about the 51-year-old marrying the 16-year-old and how it should be vice versa.
Or perhaps the family that foreclosed on Bank of America in Florida recently.
Oh, I heard about that too. But anyway, we'll save that for another time. Years ago, they used to deed the houses over to the banks without the banks knowing them, and then the banks used to have all the problems. But thank you so much for coming. Remember to see us at the library, Live at the Library. And Camille?
Remember, this is your show. We need to hear from you because that determines which topics we have and which guests we have. The reason we had Emily today is because people wanted to know more about this foreclosure topic. So let us hear from you. Send us your emails. Remember, this is your show. The law, your money,
And you.